some things here on the ferry, the ferries and the history of the Sino Canal. Turn it over to Ralph Buglis, who's done an incredible job. You'll see doing some research on that topic. And then we'll have a panel after that to respond to questions. And certainly we're also encouraging audience questions as well. There's a mic over there, so all you have to do is walk up to that mic and ask the question if you want to. So I'll move this out of the way after we're done, and the panel will take over. So most of you who live in the Western County know that White's Ferry, after operating successfully for much of the time since it began running in the late 1700s, suddenly closed in December 2020. The ferry is part of the history, culture, and economy of the Western County and the Ag Reserve. And White's Ferry itself is a living history example of farming and the small town life that exemplifies what the Ag Reserve was and is today. While many are familiar with White's Ferry, having used it to cross the river or as a jumping off point for hiking on the C&O Canal, it's a fair bet that far fewer know the history of the ferries along the Montgomery County segment of the Potomac River and the C&O Canal, including White's Ferry, and the role they played in the evolution and growth of Montgomery County, especially our farming area in the Western County. That's why the Historic Medley District, Montgomery History, and the Fair Access Committee are sponsoring this forum on this topic tonight. The centerpiece tonight is research that's been spearheaded by Ralph Buglis to my left, and Ralph will start with a really excellent slide presentation crystallizing some of the points that he's been able to come up with. And there's a really good group of people that worked with him, including William Bauman, Jim Poole, John Wools, Rod Mackler, Marianne Kephart, Charles Jacobs, and myself. So, and some of those people actually have written documents that they've been accessing as well. Many dozens of ferries crossed the Potomac River the last 2 centuries. Montgomery County, formed in 1776, once ran all the way south to what is now the District of Columbia. As a result, 6 ferries once operated along the Montgomery County section of the Potomac. 3 other ferries once operated along the Potomac bordering the upper portion of today's Montgomery County, including, starting from the northern edge, Spinks Ferry, going a little farther south, White's Ferry, once called Conrad's Ferry, and then going a little farther south, Edwards Ferry. For most of the county's history, ferries were the main means of getting across the river in Montgomery County, transporting people and goods. For centuries and through generations, the ferries helped farmers, craftsmen, and small manufacturers make a living by taking their goods to the C&O Canal, which carried them south or up north to be processed or sent them back and forth across the river. In return, the ferries carried back from Cumberland and Washington, D.C., a variety of often processed goods such as building materials, plaster, and even tools. The ferries and the canal also carried people up and down as well as across the river. Ferry connections created important, lasting economic, social, and cultural linkages that helped intricately interlace communities on both sides of the Potomac, tying together western Montgomery County and the greater Leesburg area in Loudoun County, Virginia. The success of the ferries also stimulated the growth of small towns along the river, particularly at White's Ferry and Edwards Ferries. Granaries and grain warehouses, small stores, and even post offices were built at some of these locations. Edwards Ferry, in particular, became a successful small town. Today, you can still see evidence of this in the form of foundations for the granaries at White's Ferry and a store at Edwards Ferry. 6 African American communities evolved around Poolesville most after the Civil War. It's possible foodstuffs grown in these communities, built around farms and small tool making, were part of the shipments that were sent along the C&O Canal during its heyday. Recent research by Melissa Blair of the University of Maryland suggests that Black farmers produced a wide range of agricultural products in Montgomery County, but census data from the time obscures or undervalues much of what was produced. For centuries, the only way to get across the Potomac River in our area were the 3 ferries that once operated. They closely tied together western Montgomery County and Loudoun County, as well as Poolesville and Leesburg. In tandem with the canal, the 2 ferries lasting the longest, White's and Edwards, significantly helped boost the economy in our area. Even after the canal closed, White's Ferry had successfully transitioned to carrying motor vehicles, maintaining the ties formed between northern Loudoun County and western Montgomery County that developed over generations. There is a rich history in our area, with White's Ferry being the only, quote, living history, unquote, example of the era of ferries and the C&O Canal. The ferries revival is important in our view to our modern transportation system and will help keep the heritage and tradition that it represents with us. Ralph will go into detail on these points and many more. After he finishes his talk, we will have a panel of local history leaders who will offer perspectives on the presentation and other issues related to the history of ferries and the canal in the western part of our county. The audience can also come up to the mic over here and ask questions as well. I'd like to have my co-host for the evening, Mike Kiplinger of Historic Medley District, and Matt Logan of Montgomery History come up for some brief remarks too to greet you. So, Knight, would you start? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, I want to tip my hat to Link Hoeing for this wonderful concept. Well done. And we're very collaborative out here in Western Montgomery County. So the first thing Link did was contact us at Historic Medley District and our friends in Rockville at Montgomery History to contribute our thoughts to the structure of this, the flow of this, and all of that. For those of you who don't know, Historic Medley District is the historical society of Western Montgomery County, coinciding roughly to the western half of today's Ag Reserve, from Sugarloaf Mountain down the Potomac River to Seneca, Maryland. It's called Historic Medley District because the third election district of Montgomery County after the year 1800 was called the Medley District. It was named after the polling place, which was a tavern in Bellsville. Yes, white men went to vote at a saloon in Bellsville, John Medley's Tavern, and the tavern gave its name to the entire polling place. So we're trying to keep that bit of eccentric, idiosyncratic Montgomery County history alive. Our organization is all about educating the people of Montgomery County, not just our Western County citizens, but all the county, about the rich, unusual, and sometimes troubled past of this western part of the county. And the transportation, the canal, the roads, the coming of the B&O spur in 1873 across our Medley district, all those were very important, and the ferries are central to this story. I point out to people that Edwards Ferry was really a lane between the twin cities of Poolesville, Maryland, and Leesburg, Virginia, in social affairs, commerce, banking, in every respect. Poolesville and Leesburg were, in fact, twin cities. And Edwards Ferry between the two, you've got Edwards Ferry Road in Loudoun County today, going right through 1 million square feet of shopping centers right into Leesburg, and our Edwards Ferry Road down to the old ferry is a somewhat more bucolic lane. Very, very important. Both White's Ferry and Edwards Ferry linked these two cities together socially, commercially, economically. Ralph Bouglis is just a treasure of historical research to our county, and we're delighted that he has done such a great job on this presentation. So, Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt Logan. I'm the executive director of Montgomery History, the county's historical society. We've been around since 1944, and we are thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled that Ralph was invited to give this talk tonight. He is part of what we have as a speakers bureau. We've got about 40 different speakers on different topics on county history. If you have an organization, senior center, library, civic group of any kind, Ralph and his colleagues can come out and give a talk. It's very, very popular and very well used. There are three dates I want to get on your calendar. One is July 30th. Ralph is going to do this same talk via Zoom. So if you know, I see MCM is here recording, but if there's someone that you know that wants to see this, or we'll be able to offer it via Zoom, and then it'll be available via recording. We also every year do an ice cream social, and it's a free event for everyone. You don't have to be a member or supporter. And that's going to be down near Montgomery Mall at the Shirley Povich Field. Very fun event. We usually get 100, 200 people to show up for that. And then October 19th, I believe that's the Sunday, is our annual history conference. That's going to be at the Rockville campus, Montgomery College. And this is, Knight didn't mention this, it's the 50th anniversary of the historic Medley District. And so we've invited Knight and Maureen to give a talk about not just 50 years of the organization, but sort of the history of this part of the world and how that's changed over time. Our closing session, so that'll be a breakout session. The closing session will be a short documentary that was um, created by a local student on the desegregation of Poolsville High School. It's really an excellent piece of work, and we're thrilled that we're going to have an opportunity to do that. And I've asked Knight to moderate a panel discussion afterwards. So we're really looking forward to that. So again, thank you, Ralph's. You're going to love his talk, and I guess I'll turn it over to Ralph. Okay.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. One more just quick note. David Fraser Dogg, one of our other delegates, is here tonight as well. So I wanted to acknowledge him as well. Thanks for coming.
Well, thanks everyone for coming out tonight for this a very important topic. As I don't have to tell you, this is all related to the closing of White's Ferry and looking at the historical background of the ferries as a group. I want to say up front that this is very much a collaborative effort. There's been research provided by a number of people who I will give credit to during the talk. In many ways, I'm just the storyteller. And we're packing in a lot of information here. We want to keep this presentation to about a half an hour. So follow along with the slides if you would. You don't need to be looking at me. I don't know why you want to be. Some detail will be in the slides that I'll just be able to allude to. So as you heard, we're going to be focusing on the historical significance of the Potomac River ferries, an importance really that White's Ferry retains today, despite its lamentable closure. As Link so well put it, a living history example of a long heritage of close ties between Western Montgomery County and Loudoun County across the Virginia River. Now, I chose this map, it's actually from the Civil War, because it comes the closest to showing all the ferries, as you heard, 6 ferries in Montgomery County, the stars there that you see, once existed beginning in colonial times. Now, the 2 lower stars there are inside what is D.C. today, but at the time that was part of Montgomery County. I'll run through the history of each ferry, but to set the stage, perhaps the best way to underscore the ferry's importance is pointing out that there was no Potomac River Bridge anywhere in Montgomery County until well into the 20th century, the infamous American Legion Bridge, when the Beltway opened. So, for most of the county's history, ferries were the main means of getting across the Potomac, as you heard, transporting both people and goods, and thus for centuries through generations, creating those important and lasting economic, social, and cultural ties, linking together, as I said, Western Montgomery County and the Leesburg area. And I think you can get a sense of that from this 1854 map. It's a map of Loudoun County showing western Montgomery also up at the top there. The 2 main ferries, what became White's Ferry and Edwards Ferry, connecting, as Knight so well put it, the Twin Cities. I love that. The Twin Cities of Poolsville and Leesburg. Leesburg at the bottom, Poolsville at the top there, and really about equidistantly between the 2 ferries, Edwards and White's Ferry. The close connections are also borne out by identical family names on markers in Union Cemetery in Leesburg, and Monocacy Cemetery in Bellsville. These names, just a sampling here, are some pretty well-known family names. And in fact, Trundle, the first one I've listed there, I'll mention at the end of the talk. But perhaps most importantly, the ferries were especially significant because of the adjacent C&O Canal as a commercial waterway to D.C. for the 90 years that the canal was open through Montgomery County. Though initially the canal was something of an obstacle for people and goods just to get across it. But in the main, the canal was a big part of the ferry's importance because of carrying that cargo. And products, farm products like corn, wheat, oats, much of it grown in Loudoun County and then brought by the ferries across the river to be shipped down to D.C. along with products from here. So let's quickly run through the 6 ferries, starting from the westernmost edge of Montgomery County. That's Spinks Ferry, what is shown here as Hauling Ferry. Some of these ferries had varied names over time as the owners changed. And sometimes the names held on even after a change of ownership and renaming. Spinks was just downstream from another important ferry, Nolan's Ferry, but that was just over the county line in Frederick. Spinks also just a little below the C&O Canal aqueduct across Monocacy River. Next, Conrad's Ferry, later and best known as White's Ferry. Notice the apostrophe. Sometimes there's an apostrophe in these names, sometimes not. I've used the most common versions that you see today. Also notice in that small inset map, cannons showing its strategic importance in the Civil War. And this dot indicated a warehouse or granary to store grain, tying again into the main theme of this talk, the ferries as vitally important in transporting farm products. I also want to mention right away, you often hear that the name White's Ferry came about when it was bought by Elijah Veers White, a Poolesville native and big Confederate figure during the Civil War. But not so. Stay tuned. Next, Edwards Ferry. Always had that name. Again, notice cannons and a warehouse. Then the lesser known ferries further downstream. Conn's Ferry, erroneously labeled Coons Ferry on this map, opposite a long gone community, Matildaville in Virginia. This ferry about a mile above Great Falls. And then lastly, the 2 at the bottom, both gone by the time of this map, but I indicated them with stars here, and existing when that area was part of Montgomery County. The county, of course, formed in 1776, and then D.C. carved out in 1790. So first is Aubrey's Ferry, about where Chain Bridge is today, and then McGee's Ferry, just below where Key Bridge is today. So here's a simplified version of the 6. The westernmost ones are what I will call the big 3. They were the most important and lasted the longest. And here roughly are their years of operation. White's and Edwards Ferry, really the big 2, you might say. And although White's outlasted all of them, Edwards, for much of its life, eclipsed White's Ferry, which may be a bit of a surprise. These lower 3, long gone when the big 3 were thriving, but just a few more quick details about them. Conn's Ferry, as I said, just a little above Great Falls, actually just above Conn Island near Great Falls. It ran from the Maryland side of the Potomac to what is now Riverbend Park in Virginia, about where the boat ramp for the park is, and not in existence very long. Aubrey's Ferry ran to the mouth of a creek called Pimmit Run in Virginia. This sign notes that that spot was an early industrial area, so logical that there would be a ferry there in operation because, as I explained, it shows lots of people and things needed to get across that new body of water, the canal. But of course, overall, the canal, a tremendous economic boost for shipping the farm products grown on both sides of the river. And emphasizing that, there were warehouses on both sides of the river at Edwards Ferry and post offices, further indicating significant communities on both sides. Now, we have records of canal shipping from newspapers at the time. Here's an Alexandria Gazette report. Alexandria was a destination via the Potomac River in addition to Georgetown at the end of the canal. This shows two barges arriving from Edwards Ferry as well as from Spinks Ferry, labeled Monocacy here, all in just one day, April 18th, 1845. William Bauman, here in the audience today, a meticulous researcher, has tracked these shipments over many years and also using the Evening Star, a longtime DC paper, for arrivals in Georgetown. So let me show you what he compiled for that whole year, 1845. This is just trips, barges from Edwards Ferry. It goes on for several slides here. Lots of details. An astounding number of barge trips over the course of that year, just from Edwards Ferry alone, 95 altogether. Now, this shows a 14-year period prior to the Civil War, summarizing all that shipping data that William compiled for individual years, not just 1845, of barges originating from Edwards Ferry, not just boats passing through, but starting out from Edwards Ferry with cargo loaded there. 1845, with its 95 barge trips that we just saw, actually sort of puts it in the middle of the pack, some years more, some less. So this shows what a remarkable shipping hub Edwards Ferry was. Far more boat trips than from either White's or Spinks ferries at that time, but I'll get into both of them coming up. Then came the Civil War, and the ferries were strategically important. So important, Union troops were stationed there, and an important site even at the war's end. Here's a magazine illustration of Edwards Ferry at the time. Now, the war generally curtailed shipping along the canal and across the ferries, but some continued. And from this Leesburg Library document, you get the sense that it was practically viewed as contraband, the products being crossed by the ferries, viewed as contraband by the federal government, a little known fact and another indication of the ferry's importance. After the war, Elijah Beers White, later of White's Ferry, also became one of Edwards Ferry's owners. And partly through advertising like this, he made it even more of a shipping hub than it was before, as well as boosting the other ferry upstream that he's better known for, that I'll get into in a moment. So here's a different type of graph to highlight the post-Civil War shipping boom. Again, still Edwards Ferry. Rather than the number of barge trips, this shows total grain amounts by year. And in a word, Edwards Ferry was bustling. Note 1889 at the far right. A major flood that year diminished shipping and a harbinger of the end of the canal, which came several decades later. But until then, Edwards Ferry was bustling to such an extent that the canal lock there was extended to allow two boats to go through at the same time to speed things up. and a large store opened right next to the lock. But then the canal closed altogether after another big flood, 1924, and that brought an end to Edwards Ferry's prosperity. Some photos of Edwards Ferry over time. There's the store, again, the store in the middle there. After closing, the store sat vacant for decades and crumbled, but the National Park Service has partially rebuilt it as a reminder of the community that once existed. Now, this article from the Evening Star in the early 20th century notes a new ferry boat is now carrying a newfangled invention, the automobile, but also confirming that Edwards Ferry, still at that point, the early 20th century, before the canal's closure, famous as a big shipping point. Accompanying that article, a not so great photo. Maybe you can make out the ferryman on the far right and an early car being carried by the ferry boat at Edwards Ferry, not just White's Ferry. And while I have been stressing farm products, it was indeed also people coming across the ferry to take passenger boats, what are called packet boats here. Taking packet boats ran on the canal either direction. But you'd never know all this went on at Edwards Ferry from the serene setting that it is today. On the Virginia side, an important connection to Black history comes from this article. Also operating a pre-Civil War ferry was a free Black man who owned a warehouse in addition to his ferry boat, and the boat he may have used to help escaping enslaved people, as noted on this cemetery marker and depicted by this mural in nearby Leesburg. And just downstream from Edwards Ferry was the Goose Creek River Lock. This let boats into the C&O Canal after they crossed the Potomac River from another canal along Goose Creek over on the Virginia side, adding to all that business at Edwards Ferry. This lock is just a stream today, belying, again, what a bustling hub Edwards Ferry was at one time. For most of the time, even more so than White's Ferry. So let's move on to it. Originally called, as you heard, Conrad's Ferry for the first owner's first name, a bit unusual, though a later owner, interestingly, had the last name Conrad. Now, remember, the opening of the canal was a tremendous benefit, but also a bane, that is an obstacle. So here, a culvert, a tunnel under the canal, was built for roadway access. Now, I showed an earlier graph like this for Edwards Ferry, a 14-year period of shipping data pre-Civil War. This is the same period for White's Ferry now. And note the most number of barge trips starting out from here, from White's Ferry in 1845, only 11 compared to that whopping 95 that same year at Edwards Ferry. So shipping from Edwards was a whole different order of magnitude at that time. But White's Ferry would boom after the Civil War. I want to highlight one other year here, 1849, and again bring in the shipping data that William Bauman compiled for that year to show that shipping by barges was two-way. That is, many of the boats bringing back other products and goods from D.C., including to spots in Virginia carried over by the ferries. And this was not only the case here at White's Ferry, but at the other ferries as well. And as at Edwards Ferry, it was people also being transported by White's Ferry to connect with the canal, packet boats again. About this time, White's Ferry got its current name when a predecessor to Elijah White, another member of the Poolesville White family, bought the ferry. And that's when it began to be called White's Ferry, well before its later ownership by Elijah White. Thanks to John Walls and Jim Poole for this myth buster, you might say, and a lot of other research by both Jim and John for this talk. Thank you. Like at Edwards Ferry, the Civil War, very important. Some details there. Then, after the Civil War, White's Ferry boomed, in large part due to Elijah White's ownership, and now warehouses and or granaries on both sides of the river, like at Edwards Ferry. Similarly, a post office for the now bustling site. How much shipping was going on? Well, this is similar to the post-Civil War shipping boom graph that I showed for Edwards Ferry. And this one shows White's Ferry was now pretty much on par with Edwards in terms of the amount of grain being shipped down the canal. Its peak years, roughly the mid-1870s to the mid-1880s. And the highest number of barge trips in one year just was now 42, compared to, as we saw, a pre-Civil War high here at White's Ferry of just 11 in one year. So this is when White's Ferry really came into its own as a significant shipping hub. And now the time just beyond this graph, the late 1800s, early 1900s, were also the peak years for the canal in terms of carrying coal from Cumberland. And one unfortunate incident underscores this. So, besides farm products, ferrying coal was also important. The next ferry owner started ferrying cars, which brings us to the all important transition of White's Ferry to carrying motor vehicles, as all of this details, especially after Edwards Ferry and the whole canal closed. White's Ferry, of course, serving this important function up until, as I said, its lamentable closing. Some photos of White's Ferry over time. You see the granary there close to the canal and the warehouse off to the right, both very large. A later bridge across the canal instead of using that culvert. The bridge, of course, partially survives. The warehouse and granary still stood up until the mid 1960s, but deteriorating, and now only the foundations remain. And some photos of White's Ferry's evolution carrying cars. It was Elijah White who named an earlier ferry boat for his Confederate commander, Jubal Early, who indeed crossed the Potomac River nearby during the Civil War. And that name stuck through the 20th century until the most recent boat was renamed Historic White's Ferry. All right, the last ferry now, Sphinx Ferry, first named Clapham's Ferry. It faced quite a bit of competition early from Nolan's Ferry, just upstream, as I said, in Frederick County. Nolan's also a very big shipping hub over time, reinforcing this story about Montgomery County's ferries. But it was in Frederick County, so I'm just mentioning it here. As we saw earlier, Sphinx Ferry, also called Hallings Ferry at one time, before the canal opened, it was an important link between Virginia and all the way up to Baltimore, important road there. And then about the time the canal opened, it became known for the rest of its life as Sphinx Ferry. Like elsewhere, a bridge, store, post office, and granary. but ultimately closing before the other two. But for a while, a bit busier than White's Ferry, even. And to see that, here's a graph of, again, barge trips per year, boats starting out from Spinks Ferry, compared to the same data that I showed earlier for White's Ferry. But remember, the third ferry, Edwards, much busier in this period. The Y vertical axis there went up much higher than just 25. So in this period, pre-Civil War, Edwards was the biggest of the big three. And remember, these are trips by boats originating from Spinks Ferry. So let's focus just on 1851 and again bring in the shipping data provided by William. In fact, the two main boats from Spinks Ferry were owned by local farmers. And there's the name again, Trundle, that I showed in the cemetery slide about connections on both sides of the river. Reinforcing that, Hezekiah Trundle was the brother-in-law of ferry owner John Spinks. Only a few reminders of Spinks Ferry exist today, but a unique indication of its significance at one time. Knight mentioned Edwards Ferry Road on both sides. Spinks Ferry Road on the Virginia side leads to the large house built by the Spinks family in the ferry's prosperous days. Still being used today, very differently, a wedding venue. And here's its spot on this map, which in fact shows Spinks Ferry Road on the Maryland side, going through about where the power plant is today. So, summing up, the 6 ferries, for centuries, the only way to get across the Potomac River, and closely tied together western Montgomery County and Loudoun County, and especially its county seat, now city of Leesburg, in a host of ways. Together with the canal, the 2 ferries lasting the longest, White's and Edwards, very significant for shipping farm products and thus, of course, boosting the area's economy. Even after the canal closed, White's Ferry had successfully changed over to carrying motor vehicles, maintaining the ties formed over generations since colonial days. And so there's this rich history, as Link so well put it, with White's Ferry being living history example of all that we've been talking about. Its revival important to keeping this heritage and tradition with us. And among the big 3, I've said that Edwards Ferry was the busiest in many ways, but in terms of where the canal boatmen were based or where they lived, and remember, all that shipping data I showed you was from the point of origin, be it White's Ferry, Edwards, or Spinks Ferry. In this regard, where the canal boat owners lived, all 3 ferries similar over time. And to underscore that the other side of the river, Loudoun County, equally important, some boatmen lived or were based there. One last indication of the ferry's significance in terms of land value. This newspaper item announces an auction of valuable land close to the canal. Why so valuable? Well, you could put a ferry there, and it would be the only ferry between Georgetown and Edwards Ferry. So a sure moneymaker, presumably. Some hints as to where this potential ferry spot was. The best I can tell, well, never a ferry there, but it was just a little beyond the American Legion Bridge, which is where we began this talk, the dreaded American Legion Bridge. And what better way to show how good it would be to have the ferry alternative up county restored? This slide does not begin to acknowledge the tremendous research assistance provided personally by the first 4 and historical documents written by the last 3, as well as a good number of other sources. to tell this story of the importance of the Potomac River ferries over time and still today, fingers crossed.
So if the panelists would all come up, I'm going to move the screen out of the way, and we'll have a few questions for them to start off things. And certainly the audience can also ask questions. So if you just want to go up, and we'll start the conversation at that.
Is there a mic for us here? Very well done. Very well done. Speaking of this, let's see.
I think we just
Okay.
put for the room on to speak up a bit.
Yeah. You know, as Ralph said, we're being very Montgomery County chauvinistic about the boundaries of our ferry discussion today. Uh, I don't know if these are picking. Are they picking up? Right. A couple of words about Nolan's Ferry. It's in our sister county. Bit of a feedback boom there. Nolan's Ferry is up Route 28 in today's Tuscarora, on the way into Frederick County on 28. It was arguably the earliest of the ferries in this region, as early as 1735, when Philip Nolan established up there. And it was a key crossing on what was called the Great Wagon Road from Philadelphia down into the Shenandoah Valley, sometimes called the Carolina Road. There were ferries at Williamsport, Maryland, and Nolan's Ferry. And an interesting footnote of history: on May 10th, 1776, a tall red-haired gentleman from Charlottesville, Virginia, named Thomas Jefferson, crossed the Potomac River at Nolan's Ferry, heading north to Frederick, and then cutting up to Pennsylvania to go to Philadelphia, where he had some work to do. This was May 10th. Through the month of June, Mr. Jefferson worked on a draft of the Declaration of Independence, which was signed on a July 4th, not long after that. But in his own journals and diaries, Thomas Jefferson records his crossing of the Potomac at Nolan's Ferry on May 10th, 1776. It was a major crossing of hordes of immigrants, Germans, Swedes, heading from Pennsylvania German country outside Philadelphia and Lancaster, heading south into the Shenandoah Valley and eventually over the Alleghenies. Sadly and tragically, that was the site in Licksville, the long forgotten place of Licksville, of one of the largest slave transport markets in the Middle Atlantic, collecting enslaved workers being sold by impoverished plantations in Maryland and Virginia and being sold south to the booming cotton kingdom of the Deep South in America. And the Licksville slave market, right there at Nolan's Ferry, sent their human chattel down to Alexandria, Virginia, to the Armfield and Franklin slave market on Duke Street in Old Town Alexandria. So it is probably true that many of the enslaved workers of our region, when being sold by their owners, moved through Licksville, across Nolan's Ferry in both directions to the Deep South. Just a little killing time there while
Can we stay on that point for just a minute? Because I know, Ralph, when you guys were doing the research and I saw the email traffic back and forth, because of the C&O Canal and the ferry traffic and the commerce that it generated, there's evidence that that actually generated more slaves in the plantations around our area as a result of the success of the ferries and the C&O Canal.
Yes, maybe John could speak to that quite well.
The 1850 slave census for the Medley district, there were about 1,300 slaves listed, and by 1860, there were approximately 1,700. So the numbers increased, and it was all attributed to, I believe, the prosperity of the using the Canal. Because the farmers want to get the most out of their land, so they, in order to do that, they need more labor.
And
It's coincidence.
and in comparison, the rest of the county, slavery was diminishing.
And I'll give you another example. You mentioned Hezekiah Trundle. In 1840, he had 8 enslaved people on his farm. By 1850, he had 23. By 1860, he had 32. And his farm was along the Little Monocacy River, and he had the boat Maryland. And those boats that you mentioned, Sphinx Ferry, they were actually being loaded at the Monocacy Basin by the Monocacy Aqueduct.
Which you can still see today.
And William Bauman, he and I were bouncing back and forth some ideas. As I asked him, I said, William, when they loaded the boats at the grain warehouse, how did the horses get to the other side? And the reason why I say horses is because Hezekiah Trundle, in his agriculture inventory census, he just had horses. So we think he used horses. Williams said, well, the horses went from where the grain warehouse was down the path. You can still see the path that goes underneath the first arch and up the ramp that you showed in the video. And then they would pull the boats across to the towpath side. They would hook up the horses and go on down.
Ralph and Randy, Randy, you can probably comment on this, but I know Ralph can too because of the research. But um, why did White's Ferry survive? I know some of it was what we talked about, what Ralph talked about, the farm traffic. But why was it successful? Was it because of Ed Brown essentially in 1946 buying it? Was he the key
Well, when he
linchpin that made it
bought it,
happen?
at the time he bought it, it was not operating at that moment. He took it over right after the war, and he had a partner, and he bought the ferry, and was able to probably get more pedestrian traffic at this point. After the war, people were coming back, GIs were getting houses, buying cars, and roads were being built on both sides, and so there was more of a demand for the residents to use it rather than just the farming. So
Yeah, I mean, as Ralph pointed out, until 1962, there was no bridge crossing of the Potomac between Chain Bridge in the District of Columbia and Point of Rocks in Frederick County. It's quite remarkable that the whole length of Montgomery County did not have a bridge crossing over a distance of 45 miles or so. But today, even with the congestion, the American Legion Bridge, arguably we need another bridge crossing, but that is a can of worms we're not going to open today.
Don't say that when the Igers are.
Something else we noticed during our research, and William Bauman was questioning why did the shipments from Monocacy Basin stop about, was it 1871? And so I said, well, that's when the Metropolitan Branch started running out of nearby, down to Washington D.C.
Dickerson
Yep.
had 3 sightings. Well, that the farm people load their product into the car at their leisure. The boxcar was full, and Buffalo was taken down to the port of D.C., where they would sell it right out of the boxcar. So they got paid instantly with no middleman. They drive straight back home. So
you also have to remember that in our area, the population of Poolsville wasn't that much different in the 50s than from the Civil War. And it wasn't until 1960s when the water expansion came in and the population of Poolsville started to expand. So that was another immediate residential resource for Mr. Brown.
it's a question about the business of a ferryman. So I noticed that every one of these ferries had a grain warehouse on both sides. Is the implication of that that the ferryman would buy the grain directly off the farmers, and then the ferryman would make money off bringing that grain down to the market down in DC or Georgetown, or did somebody else, not the ferryman, own those grain depositories? I mean, it seems to me if I was a ferryman, I'd build a depository on both sides and buy it from the farmers and ship it down. But what actually happened?
Well,
Oh, that's a great question.
if you want the answer, yeah. So at the Monocacy Basin, I believe his name was it William Trundle. He built the grain warehouse before the Civil War. He didn't own a ferry boat, so he operated the grain warehouse, and then they would unload, into the canal boats at the White's Ferry. Daniel White built the grain warehouse, so he operated, and then they would load the canal boats. It was not the ferryman. Then at Edwards Ferry, I know after the Civil War, Elijah White, and he built a granary at White's Ferry, and they also had warehouses at Edwards Ferry, Maryland. So he owned those warehouses. So he controlled the farm produce that was coming off of.
Right, so it's true. Ferry guys, the enterprising business were buying grain from the farmers and shipping it down. It just implies that by looking at it. Second question: how the heck did these ferries get across I know how to get across now, and maybe how they got across during the time of the internal combustion engine. But before that, what was the locomotion of these ferries in the current going back?
So Ralph had a picture from Edwards Ferry, the early 1909. And you can see the ferryman pulling the boat with the car on the boat.
It also looked like it was hooked to a cable.
Yes, at some point a cable was then used, and then eventually motors. But exactly when, I'm sure it varied, depending on the ferry.
Skip, could you talk a little bit? Melissa Blair did a paper, then I think I shared it with you too, but I read that, and I think you did too, Ralph. That was very interesting. She's University of Maryland. She looked at the amount of produce and grains and that kind of thing that were produced by African American farms out here, and there was a lot actually. And the big woods actually did quite a bit, but it was undercounted by the census. They kind of ignored some of that activity, but I think it's probably true that a lot of that also contributed to not only the growth of agriculture out here, but also the C&O Canal and the ferry traffic.
Without a doubt. And thank you very much for inviting me. I've learned a lot, I'm telling you. And also I learned that I was an historian.
Did I get that wrong?
I know, we're all historians.
Yeah, if you hang around,
Everybody our age is a historian.
I think you get that title because when you reach a certain age, you become a historian. Most of my family is from Sugar Land. I've done talks for a number of years, maybe 10, 15 years about the African American community. And you alluded to there were 6. I won't go through every single one, but these were free farmers, industrial people, and they surround Foodville. And a lot of folks who live in Foodville, and who've been here for a long time, because 2 or 3 of those communities have completely dried up, don't know that they existed, but they did exist. And for what it's worth, because these farmers were free, they actually contributed mightily to the economy of Foodville proper. And otherwise, and I said in some of my talks that Foodville would have been just another zip code like Belleville, Dickerson, Barnesville. But these African American communities, Sugar Land, Jerusalem, Big Woods, Jonesville, some of the names people have never heard of. Martinsburg, of course. Selman. Well, Selman was not a mixed community. That was a mixed community among the two. But again, because of my relationship with Link and him bringing forward another piece of the puzzle I learned that they didn't just become, they just didn't settle here. How did they get here? And for what it's worth, listening to Ralph, there must have been some sort of measure for them being transported here. Now I think it was John who said that there was 1,700. That's a low number compared to the Eastern Shore, where 40,000, 40,000 African Americans in Worcester County, uh, Somerset County, uh, the
Talbot.
Talbot County, all the Eastern Shore counties, that because of course, the location, 40,000, nearly 40,000 African Americans were there. And they worked their way up the coast. How do they do that? Some of the stories that we were told were the Underground Railroad. There are all sorts of tales. But the one that struck me today was Mr. Basil. His his operation to get slaves from the lower Potomac and the Chesapeake Bay up county and west to Western Maryland, which to me is uh, the source of these 6 African American communities. There was a tremendous love-hate relationship. I won't go into a love-hate relationship between Abraham Lincoln and the state of Maryland. Uh, I think when in the 1960 election, he got maybe
About 50.
2%, 2.5% of the total vote. That's all he got, and he got 50 votes from Montgomery County. 50. He got 50 votes. But again, there were only white males voting at that time. But besides that, he was always very much aware of Maryland because of the way its proximity to the state nation's capital, of course. And of course, Poolsville was uppermost in his mind because of White's Ferry and the ability of Robert E. Lee to come across with his cavalry at low tide. So he was always paranoid about it, and so therefore he allowed Maryland to keep their slaves. He allowed Maryland to keep their slaves even though they were below the Mason-Dixon line and they were Confederate leaning. But I say all that to say that because these communities, African American communities, survive and are still somewhat surviving surrounding Poolsville, my interest was how in the world did they get here?
Well, Skip, Montgomery,
answer
Montgomery County was settled by a Western movement from Southern Maryland. Montgomery County was settled by some German settlers coming down from Frederick, but most of them were Englishmen coming from Tidewater with their enslaved labor coming west. So the early settlers of the Poolsville area were small farmers with a small number of enslaved workers coming from Anne Arundel, St. Mary's, that area, coming up from Tidewater and coming up from what became DC later. So they didn't come on their own. They were brought by their owners from the large population that you noted in Southern Maryland.
But who freed them?
Oh,
Where they gained freedom?
Well, I mean, they were they were literally freed by the Maryland Constitution in 1864. Maryland was the only state in the history of the United States that ended slavery, abolished slavery by a vote. Now, it was a rigged vote. It was a rigged vote. You had to take a loyalty oath to vote, and a lot of whites in Montgomery County refused to do that. If you were away fighting for the Confederacy, as many young men in Western Montgomery County were, you couldn't vote. And even with the election rigged in favor of the 1864 Constitution that abolished slavery, it barely passed.
Barely passed.
Montgomery County did not vote for the abolition of slavery in the 1864 Constitution, nor did Frederick County. Most of the Maryland counties around today's Washington did not vote to end slavery in that 1864 vote. A little known fact, but it did pass.
Adding to the rigged nature of that election was that Union soldiers from elsewhere who were stationed in Maryland at the time were allowed to vote,
Exactly.
and they proved to be the margin of difference.
So, yes, Maryland can be proud of being the only state in America to abolish slavery by a popular vote, but it was not so popular a vote, and it just squeaked by. So, in the District of Columbia, slavery was abolished 1 year after the Civil War began. So, the Union capital of Washington, D.C., had 1 year of slavery into the Civil War, but it was abolished by the federal government by edict, not by vote.
You know, what I find amazing is the population of Poolsville was about 300. It had 1,700 slaves in the area. Put that in perspective. And somewhere, and this is not, it's my understanding about 40% of the homes had slaves, and the typical slave owner was only 2 or 3. So we must have had massive plantations to get that number. I understand it. Al Chappelle, is that how you pronounce it?
Ex-La Chapelle. Yeah.
I never took French.
That was
I took Russian, but not French. I don't know how to say it right. But anyway, they must have had a huge number. To get that number out of a population of 300 is an amazing number.
I mean, in Montgomery County, the largest slave holdings were about 100, 120. George Peter, who lived at Montverde on Berryville Road, just east of Seneca Creek, he had maybe 120 enslaved workers. His nephew, who built Montevideo in Seneca, had 20 or 25 enslaved workers.
Do we know how many plantations there were out here?
Yes.
Do we have an idea?
Peters were in-laws.
Yes, I've taken in fact, the Martin and Bond and Martinet map that is displayed over there, and again, just the Medley district, and going through using the census showing people who landowners who had enslaved people, and it's slightly more than half of the landowners in the Medley district.
So it's closer to 50 than 40.
Yeah.
But, and if you look at that map, a lot of them along the Potomac River had slaves.
Yeah, I mean, we
It was
forget.
All in all, there had to have been, some of these places must have had much more than 100 slaves.
No, actually not. That would be a very
100 is about the cap.
yeah.
Well, I question
members of the Young family.
Individual ownership.
Yeah.
I believe at the African American Museum in Washington, where they have a home that was in our area, I understand that they did say that Al Chappelle had well over 1,000 slaves.
No, that's not correct.
That's what it says in the meeting.
Well, that's not correct. That was one of the Brewer family properties, but there was no 1,000 enslaved workers on any
one farm.
Any one farm under any one ownership in Montgomery
That
County.
could be correct.
Yeah.
Could you, John, I know you're really expert on this, but could you talk a little bit about why the Canal Canal declined? I know there were a lot of floods. There's also train competition. What made it decline and mainly stop working in 1924?
Well, high roads started to be improved, and the truck transportation, they could move their produce, like even Northern Virginia, Loudoun County, or Montgomery County. They could, and the trains, it's easier to put it on the trains and transport it. And the canal, it kept losing money after 1889, when it reopened 1891. A railroad owned the canal then, and just it was hard to keep up. There were continual floods. They had to keep repairing the canal, and the heyday was in the 1870s for the canal. It just slowly declined over the years, and I think in 1923 that was the last operating season. There were maybe 25 boats left on the canal in 1923.
I mean, over its whole life of existence, the C&O Canal was a money losing business. It was like many airlines in America over their entire life, have barely broken even. But the year the canal broke ground at Little Falls, John Quincy Adams turning the first spade of earth and hitting rocks and roots and not able to turn a spade of earth at all. Charles Carroll was turning the first spade in Baltimore for the B&O Railroad. Same day in 1828. The railroad got to Cumberland years before the canal got to Cumberland. That's as far as the canal went. The railroad blew past Cumberland to West Virginia and onto the Ohio River and all of that. So it never made much money. As John just said, the golden era of the C&O Canal was the 1870s when coal in Western Maryland. Cumberland was a boom town. It was a gold rush town of black gold called coal. The coal shipments from Western Maryland down the C&O Canal to Georgetown in the 1870s and early 80s made the canal briefly profitable for maybe 10 years. And then it was a long decline after that. The floods got worse. The B&O Railroad spur siphoned off traffic. As John said, improved the roads. And the 1924 flood was the nail in the coffin.
But that's not to take away its importance connected to the ferries as a local commercial pathway to Washington.
Oh, go ahead, Bob. Oh, okay.
Thank you for your presentation. You showed a lot of theological remains of buildings. I'm one of the quartermasters of House 25. And so we have Darbo's floor, but there's no signage there. There's nothing there that tells anybody what that is. And I'm sure that there are ruins all through Montgomery County, but there's no guideposts, there's no information. What can we do? I'm afraid that we'll be gone before we've had a chance to mark them, identify them, and have a proper way of visiting to learn more about the canal.
John can provide a lot more detail, but remember that the canal now is owned by the National Park Service. And to get, well, go ahead.
So I've been, from time to time, I try to encourage the park to erect wayside signs at different locations. And I attended the Federal Advisory Commission with the C&O Canal in May. And that was one of the things on my list to have wayside signs at each of the locks in Western Montgomery County. And supposedly my list is under review by higher management. So I'm supposed to get a response back someday. And it includes other things like restoring the Seneca Aqueduct and doing something with the stone cutting mill. So there's a lot of history that's being forgotten, and I have rediscovered it with the help of some of my friends like Jim Poole and William Bauman and Karen Gray, she's passed. But so I write stories, and a lot of them are in the Monocacy Monocle.
In other words, it's a government bureaucracy, and the federal, and it's a lot harder than dealing with Poolesville City Hall.
One of the things that some of you may know, and I know obviously John knows this and Ralph and I think everybody on the panel does, but there's actually a master plan that the Park Service is actually working on right now about White's Ferry. It actually owns 67 acres there at White's Ferry. And they've got a master plan, which is actually up. You can read it now. It will be one of the, I guess, the largest campsite along the entire C&O Canal would be right there at White's Ferry. So it could be a huge draw for people to come to that area.
And right across from that campground, on the Virginia side, is the upcoming. It will be opening soon. The White's Ferry Brewery.
Yeah. On the other side of the river. But yeah.
And on the wish list is possibly a museum there with so much of the research that we compiled for this that didn't have time to present. But
Well, we raised the idea, Ralph, but honestly, knowing how that works, getting the money for it is probably going to be very difficult. But that is an idea that's been raised, is actually having a small museum about ferries at White's Ferry, which makes perfect sense, especially if the ferry starts running again, because we'll have a living history example of what those ferries were at one time along the
So,
Potomac River.
another thought about that is, this is, to me, important information, and there's other historical information that we need to share with everyone. But if we can't have it at White's Ferry, is there another place where we can have a museum?
Yeah,
Could it be in the Poolville area?
yeah, yeah.
But at one time, there was over 130 ferries in the state, so it was a driving force for the economy of Maryland. It's an essential part of our economic history. So there's a lot of interest outside of our area or the county, and certainly the state should also be a contributory factor. So, and I think White's Ferry, and plan to crusade on this one in the paper every chance I get, but yeah, the White's Ferry area, if we don't open it, or even if we do open it again, but if we don't, it'll be more important because of the campsite to have a state-oriented museum to honor the ferry boat industry in Maryland. It won't be a huge uh, museum, but it will be an intriguing one, and along with living history examples of life out there and other things for children to do, I am convinced it could be a reasonable weekend draw that would help recapture a lot more traffic coming out to Poolsville to go to the Ferry Museum. And so I think I'm here primarily because of my interest in history work on the White's Ferry dispute and the history of the ferry itself. They're very, very close to Ed Brown, and so I was always privy to a lot of information. And but so I personally am very, very supportive of the notion of putting a ferry industry museum out there, no matter what. But if the ferry doesn't open again, it'll become extremely important to have something out there. The campsite's going to be huge, and that'll be, helpful. But anyway, maybe we'll open another brewery on our side. I mean,
One of the other interesting
Well,
facts too, and I
maybe
think
people will
again,
buy a
people
brand
know
and
this,
throw
but
it out there.
the state of Maryland actually did a really interesting study on the C&O Canal, and they looked at it from the economic and tourism impact. And it generates $380 million every year that pretty much along those four counties that border the C&O Canal. It's a huge amount of money. And it's a lot of it is people coming here and then going elsewhere to stay after they visit the canal. But if you go take a look at that study, you'll be intrigued by how many people come. It's one of the largest, I think the top 10 national parks in the U.S. is the C&O Canal. And I bet you most people don't even recognize how important it really is as a tourist draw, but also as a part of our history.
Wow.
And the Park Service does a lot to promote it, but honestly, I don't think a lot of people appreciate what it really means for our area.
did we have a question in the back?
Is there another question? Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
That's my call out anyway. Yeah. Behind your house, horse bed and greeter. The cavalry that stationed there during the Civil War kept it working. Well, horse bed and greeter.
I can smell it.
Yeah.
Until there's no, he hunts down there.
Farms that run that property thing that fill out some really near the Stella area. So I would suggest from an agricultural perspective, looking at the increase in slaves raising in western Montgomery County, the Eastern Shore was owned by rich landowners. The economy there was ornament and agriculture. The land was tied up for a long time. I think a lot of the people that came to the western part of Maryland were looking for, to get into agriculture. And because this is a lot of clay, a lot of shale, a lot of rocks up here, we took a lot of labor force to clear the land. We put it in condition for agriculture. And I think that's how agriculture grew. That might be a reason. I think that's the reason why maybe some of those trade species from this area. because of that. You know, stone walls around, it's all field stone. One white guy's out there. So I think you might find, and now we have this agricultural reserve in 2,000 acres that set aside zoning perspective, specifically for number one thing is shafting. I think that might draw, as conjecture on my part, I think that might come connected with agriculture. But what you guys haven't talked about, I think, is interesting. Is how does it open out the state? Because there's going to be a parkway. It's going to be paved over and be a parkway from DC all the way to West Virginia. So a few people being project out there went for a walk. It changed everything. One man.
He walked the towpath all the time. He saw other people.
Correct. Legislature now. And that's how it happened.
So that's part of the story. No, but that's only part of the story. So they did start to build the parkway, and it was once called George Washington Parkway, but it got confused because there's one on the Virginia side. They renamed it the Claire Barton Parkway. So what the federal government did, they built the parkway not over top of the canal, but next to the canal. So it began to be built, but they ran out of funding to continue the parkway going west. So that was what 1954 that Justice Douglas did his walks and challenged the Washington Post. Well, it wasn't until January 1971 that President Nixon signed the act turning into a National Historical Park. So it was Gilbert Goody and Glenn Bell who sponsored a bill that got passed by the House and then the Senate. And there were a couple of Boy Scouts that testified.
The rest of
the
it.
National Historical Park. Now, have you ever heard that part of the story?
Oh, yeah. I'm born and raised in Montgomery County.
Okay. Right. Well, it wasn't just Justice Douglas. There were others that came after him.
Absolutely. And they say it. Yeah.
And you talk about small world too, John. I actually was on J. Glenn Bell's staff at the time. So I was an intern, but I actually what? No, I wasn't.
No.
I was there.
You
So
were 12 years old.
no, I was born in '54, so I wasn't that young. But I was on his staff then, so I actually knew a lot about what he was doing. And he's a great. He only was a one-term senator, but he did quite a bit for a one-term senator.
And he knew how to pronounce B-E-A-L.
Right, Bell. Absolutely.
Not Beal.
More importantly, we all know the 1972 right? How high a word on we built something down there. We have a hard time getting from it to it. But more importantly, it's one of those things.
Got to be on stilts. That's all. Wait. Well, we know how far. Just go out to the girl, go up to the high mark, add 3 feet, you're done.
Well, I mean,
As part of what I'm sorry,
no good.
as part of some of the things that I talk about, and I'm glad that he brought that up, is the Seneca Quarry, the quarry that's of course that doesn't exist anymore, but on the C&O Canal is where the bricks, the red bricks,
There were stones.
red bricks or red stones
Stone. There you go.
were used to construct the castle, Smithsonian Castle. So that's a lot of trips down the canal. And
Yeah,
the
the Seneca.
quarry was run by the African Americans in Sugar Land and in Martinsburg. They ran that quarry for a number of years. So I'm not sure whether they crossed when you talk about the coal coming down the canal from Cumberland, but many of the houses in the area of Washington, D.C. in Columbia Heights were also used. And when
You know why it went out of business? Seneca Quarry? Because architectural taste changed overnight and they wanted white marble.
Huh.
They didn't want the brick anymore, just like
Yeah,
that.
the Victorian taste
Well,
without the brownstone, the
it
reddish
took them,
brownstone.
it
Yeah.
took them a while. If you see this,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
size of it's missing up.
So,
Yeah, it's true. The Peter family of Seneca owned the quarry and the cutting mill, and it was their enslaved labor force working both the farms and the quarry that kept that Seneca enterprise going before the Civil War. You're quite right. And there are families living on Berryville Road in the Seneca Community Church vicinity of Berryville Road and in Sugar Land who are descended from workers in the quarry. Absolutely right.
Wow.
You mentioned Peters, the house behind Dr. E, is part of the Peters Forest land plot in the area. They always gave names, hazards to life, gave names to property. And that section of Poolsville was always called Peters Forest. It was owned by Mr. Peter.
Yeah, the
And he had
Peter family owned much of the land around
Right.
today's Poolsville, especially south from Poolsville, all the sugar lands, the so-called sugar lands, a name going back to 17th century, defining the richness of the soil south of Poolsville, today's sugar land.
that house was, at one time was a tavern. And the house next to it, in 1904, was right in front of the White House in Poolsville, across from the post office. It's the Willard Homestead. And in 1904, using steam engines and logs, they rolled that house from there up to the corner next to the Peters Forest home. That's why I said in the paper, was this the first mobile home in
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. We've gone on some wonderful tangents. We love tangents.
so there's something else that we noticed, at least I noticed when we're doing this research, getting this prepared. But even Seneca, there were canal boats were stationed or docked, or started from Seneca, were loaded there, but there wasn't a ferry there, so we didn't include Seneca in this talk. But we very easily could have, or in the future, maybe have a talk about agriculture in the Medley district, over the years, because it changed. Certainly has changed.
I'm sorry, I want to go on, but I have a question. See if it makes sense. So you talked about the ferries being chartered as a public utility in Virginia going way back. Wasn't that also true in Maryland? And so White Ferry at one point was chartered as a public.
I don't know. It was always, it was chartered. An official, I think it was
So
chartered.
it was a for-profit business.
Yeah, it was a
It had a
for-profit.
license
It was
from
a-
the state of Maryland.
It's a
Since
pro-
the state owned the river, the Brown family needed a license to operate a ferry across Maryland's river, but it was always a for-profit. It was never regulated like a utility.
And it's always been privately owned. I
Yeah,
mean,
so we're using the word you.
but it
yeah.
was chartered by the state.
That's right. That's correct. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, I'd like to thank Ralph again for really kicking this discussion off. That was a great presentation. Thank you, Canal, as well.
As I said, a lot of research by other people went into it.
No, you did a great job, Ralph. I have to get my hat. If anybody has a second, I'm going to pull a chair thing out here. We're going to get the chairs up if you don't mind, if you can help with that. That'd be great. But other than that, I think we're done. Thanks.
Great to chair. I mean,
Well,
that was.
Well, that was
Yeah. You brought the chair? So we look at that. It was a story about, but, it